Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this session hosted by the Women's Economic Imperative, looking quite specifically at the issue of finance, women entrepreneurs, and issues and challenges they've experienced during COVID, but also the support and help they will need in the post-COVID recovery. This session is informed by leading experts from around the world working in the enterprise development and finance space, as well as a lovely, exciting policy brief, which was written for the T20 policy summit held in Italy recently, and which feeds into the G20 heads of government meeting coming up in November. The topics for discussion, as I mentioned, are around women entrepreneurs, and I have the joy and delight of the sun in my So we all know that women-led businesses have been particularly impacted, especially in sectors hardest hit by the pandemic. Compared with their male counterparts, women are more likely to have temporarily or permanently shut down their businesses due to the pandemic, according to the OECD. They have also more than likely had to have experienced a range of reductions in business operations, and perhaps have generated much lower sales and revenues and not been able to respond appropriately to consumer demand. This impact on women entrepreneurs of COVID will also be long lasting, we expect, and there's great concern both amongst policymakers, but especially amongst practitioners at the coalface working with women entrepreneurs, that the impacts of COVID will have a negative impact on women entrepreneurs, both in the short term, but also beyond. And so we need to think about how we can capture and share good practice around how best to support and respond, particularly to the financial needs of women entrepreneurs running their businesses and planning for economic recovery, but also growth beyond the pandemic. So by way of introduction today, I'm going to address some questions to my colleagues. I'm going to start with Dinah Bennett. Dinah, we captured very briefly as part of this introduction, the concerns around the issues that women entrepreneurs are facing. So with regards to women-led businesses, what do you think from your experience are the key good practices that can be observed, learned from, and used to address and respond to the needs of women-led businesses?
I think there are several good practices that we are able to share, looking from a woman leading a small or medium-sized enterprise. But I think also we need to address what the policymakers are doing and also look at some of the practice. And we see this all over the world, that many policymakers look at policy from a very corporate perspective. They really don't understand this entrepreneurial life world, let alone the life world of a women entrepreneur. So much of our work that we've done with colleagues in Zambia, in Kenya, in Australia, we do a lot of research on which we build programs to understand the needs of these small business owners, to really understand what challenges they're facing. And then we capacity build the bankers so they can really see what it's like from the other side of the desk. We feel that's very important because there's a huge disjoint between what bankers think women entrepreneurs need and what women entrepreneurs really need. So we really are able to actually put that across in a way that they are then able to action in terms of supporting their clients more effectively. We often hear from entrepreneurs that we don't want the bankers to give us an umbrella when the sun is shining and taking it away when it's raining. They want a relationship with their bankers for the duration. And that's one of the things we try to put across.
Dinah, thank you very much for that. You speak about the umbrella that, and this in this case, we think about the financial umbrella and support offered to women-led businesses by the banking sector. What do you think are the best ways in which bankers can best work and support entrepreneurs? You spoke about the need for a relationship-based approach by the banking sector. Can you reflect on your experience in Kenya and Zambia in terms of how you go about educating and raising the awareness of the banking sector and bank managers to better understand the needs, particularly of women-led businesses, quite separate from men, although of course men-owned businesses and women businesses experience very similar issues, but no doubt there's a view that women-led businesses have very particular needs that the banking sector needs to better understand. And I'll say this in the context particularly of the impact, going back to the impact of COVID, where we are at the risk of reversing the historic gains in gender equality, and the risk that we have of likely pushing many millions of women entrepreneurs back into poverty as a result of not being able to respond adequately to their needs. So just a few thoughts, Dinah, on with regards to that.
You have mentioned that we are reversing the historic gains in terms of equality and equity for women as a result of the pandemic, which is incredibly worrying. And particularly when we see about children not being able to go to the school, women predominantly taking responsibility for care, then, you know, they can't focus on their businesses or generating income per se if they haven't actually got a business. So it's really very important from the higher level that banks actually develop a strategy to understand not just the SME market, but women within that market as well. So it's about sub-segmenting those markets to understand the different needs, the different sectoral needs. We're seeing a lot around collateral and collateral registries being set up in some countries, which is another really positive move. We know that many women will often have a fragmented credit history for a number of different reasons, but sometimes the banks don't dig deep enough to find out what is causing this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that she will not be able to run a successful enterprise as a result of this. One of the biggest issues we find is that women are very much undercapitalized by the banks, which again, so puts them on a back foot from the get-go. So we train the bankers, but also train the women themselves in terms of how much capital should they be asking for? What are their needs? And to get the bankers to understand, as I mentioned before, what it's really like from the other side of the desk. And we are seeing from the research conducted in both Kenya and Zambia that many owner managers, both men and women, will actually go to sort of informal financiers on the street to actually get necessary funding because they will get it on the day. I mean, the payback regimes are pretty harsh, to be sure, but sometimes it can take up to 3 months for a bank to actually offer the cash that is required. And by that time, the business could well go under. So it's about sort of solving or resolving this information asymmetry where the owner managers, the women owner managers and the men owner managers are actually giving the information the banks need, but the bank actually informing them what their requirements are too. So developing a mutual and beneficial understanding for this.
Thank you, Dinah. You also spoke there, Dinah, about this research that you were doing directly with small business owner managers to understand their life or to get insight into the type of support they need from the informal banking sector. But could you share with us just very briefly some of the findings of that research around what entrepreneurs think about the banking system?
There is sometimes an often negative viewpoint, which there doesn't need to be from the entrepreneur's perspective of the banks, because many banks are really trying hard. And many of the banks that we worked with in our experience in both Zambia and Kenya, they actually have SME strategies, which is very, very important because in the main, often many banks will just be paying lip service to their SME market and also lip service to the women within that SME market as well. So there should be this synergistic relationship between these two parties because the banks can indeed benefit from a positive relationship, as can the owner managers. So it's trying to bring these two parties closer together. And I'd like to think that indeed we have done so based on what the banks have fed back to us, but also in terms of the bank's strategy. Sometimes dealing with SME is actually seen as a lower grade thing to do. Some of the more proactive and successful banks are promoting the SME managers and recognizing that the SME clients are incredibly important. So therefore making that very visible as well. I think also the segmentation and sub-segmentation of the SME market is absolutely critical. Understanding the needs of the different sectors and the different owner managers. So it's going beyond lip service, which is very, very important, and having a strategy for women-owned SMEs.
Super. Thank you for that, Dinah. Much appreciated. Now I'm going to move to address the topic of transition, how particularly micro businesses and transition into growing and becoming, I guess, more stronger as formal enterprises to engage with the financial services market and to develop their businesses, but also develop a stronger approach to how they go about managing their finances and engaging with financial services providers. So I'm going to speak with Betty Wilkinson. Betty, you're CEO of Financial Sector Deepening Zambia. And I just want to get your views with regard to the challenges that many women-led businesses have in transitioning from micro and informal into the formal sector, particularly in terms of how they, in making that transition, come across a whole series of barriers in terms of accessing finance that they need to grow and develop their businesses.
Thanks very much, Keith. And yes, it's a fundamental problem. If you look across Africa, large numbers of businesses are informal, the majority of them actually. And for women, that's even more true. So if you want to, as a woman who's moving from being doing your business as an income generating tool to something where you're actually taking on your entrepreneurial skills and making them work for you in a more formalized environment, it's tough. And it's tough for three reasons. The first is information, that you may not be keeping your records or information in a way that a bank or a formal financial institution, even an insurance company, can understand. The second problem is that digitization, which is one of the real blessings of COVID, is coming, but it's coming slowly. You have to have a smartphone, you have to have signal, you have to have access to platforms so that you can actually record the information on your business in a way that a bank will understand and accept. The third problem that women are facing is that the products that are out there are either informal and costly and small, or they're formal and time costly and hard to understand. So the bridging the gap is a key issue. And so in programs like ours, what we do is spend a lot of time not only on financial education, as Jessie will talk about later, but we also talk about how do we link the banks to financial services that are offered informally. So we're doing a lot of work in this area now, where we have groups that get together as savings groups that are all small shops. And then together they say, okay, now how are we going to be borrowing on a wholesale basis amongst ourselves? And then how are we going to share this information with banks who will then start picking us up as clients once they realize how reliable we really are? And a lot of this informal activity takes place with women. Thanks.
Betty, thank you for that. I want to pick up on this issue, I guess, of credibility, because I guess that's one of the big issues and challenges that women-led businesses have as they transform from informal to formal in terms of how they go about presenting themselves to the banks. What recommendations or suggestions have you and reflections do you have from your work with women entrepreneurs around how they can go about presenting themselves more effectively to the banking community in order for them to access the finances they need for their businesses?
One of the things that we have found is that the banks don't spend enough time and money on research to understand who these clients really are. So client centricity in products means you have to actually know who are the clients and what do they need, what do they want, and how can they cope with you. So a number of the countries like Zambia have something called FinScope, where they do a really deep dive survey to find out from the demand side what's needed. Now, the next step is say, okay, well, what are the needs of women? What are women telling you? And what the banks are discovering is that women are saying, we need it to be faster. We need it to be much more closely aligned to the type of work we do. We need to have the repayment structures, not every month on time, but adapted to our cash flow structures, which tend to be erratic. So listening, the banks need to listen, and the clients need to communicate effectively about what is our circumstances and why do we need products that are a little bit different. So this becomes a very important aspect of the work, and even more so with COVID, where people are trying desperately to recover. And in the cases of women, very often, if you're an informal business, your business is struggling, and at the same time, your family is screaming because you are the source of emergency money. So recovering means, okay, what about those assets we sold? How do we recover? Those production assets. How do we share that we can recover and are recovering? And in Zambia, interestingly, men did worse than women in the informal sector. Women actually did better in the COVID time. And that tells you that they're actually not bad when it comes to how you cope in an emergency. They're also the ones who are saying, we need to manage risk better. That's a key issue. So how do we manage risk? How do we get microinsurance? And that's now heating up in Zambia and in a number of other countries where people are saying, if we're going to have a fire in our shop and then everything is gone, where's our insurance? What are we doing about this? So thinking beyond just the loan to the financial service products, how are we going to help with the cash flow? We have a lot of cash now. Can we put it in the bank? We need a lot of cash later. Will you lend it to us? Will you give us lines of credit rather than standard, job log loan? So all of these kinds of things become very important in the process in that communication.
Thanks, Betty. Now moving very briefly on to the topic of micro enterprises, and especially those working in the broad agricultural sectors. I'm going to introduce Jessie Nyirenda. Jessie, you've done a lot of work with micro enterprises, women entrepreneurs working in very small scale enterprises, and looking at how new models of development and cooperation between women entrepreneurs provide opportunity for them to collaborate, to build cooperatives to address the challenges and the issues that they're having. In terms of the work that you're doing with these micro enterprises led by women entrepreneurs, could you just elaborate for us on the type of financial education work that you're doing with them to help them gain access to the financial support that they need?
Thank you very much, Keith. We've been working with rural-based women in the agricultural sector predominantly. And over the years, we initially started off by training them in setting up savings groups. After they had started operating as savings groups, we identified a need. There was a lack in financial education. So we used various tools that were in line with their level of education, because most of them have low literacy levels. So we were using different tools ranging from simulation and so on, and it gave them a greater understanding of not only how to record keep, but also to understand their levels of profit, liquidity, and so on. Over the years, we also noticed that as their records started improving, so did their profitability and their appetite. They started growing, and we encouraged them to register formally now as cooperatives. So now they were recognized by the state, having had cooperatives in place and so on. So with the onset of COVID, we came to another realization. I mean, we could have sat back and said, oh, we've got 1,000 and so trained women entrepreneurs. But then we had to go on and start identifying the other needs, which was there were funds that were available to help cushion the impact of COVID, but our women didn't have corporate governance structures in place. So therein now we're going back to the drawing board to try and establish how we can actually assist them to not only access these COVID relief funds, but also to help them compete on the market. You'll find international organizations that are looking for example, aggregators in rural areas buying legumes, cereals, and so on, and they put out adverts. And for them to respond, they need to put it in a structured manner, and they need to have minutes of their resolutions, just basic things like that are not in place. So these are some of now the other interventions that we want to start identifying to say, so now you've got your numbers ready, your business is working well, you've got your marketing plan strategy on point. Now let's start running our businesses like one of the big boys and start competing aggressively on the market. So I think that's quite exciting for us, because we can actually see these micro enterprises moving right into the next level of entrepreneurship, to the small and the medium level. Yeah, so that's how we've been operating.
Thank you, Jessie. I was intrigued by your observation around how there has been during COVID these interventions in place to help women entrepreneurs, but you made an interesting observation, which was many of them struggle to get access to this kind of support. What do you think are the lessons that we can learn from this to help funders rethink and recalibrate how they go about supporting women entrepreneurs?
I think it's constant monitoring and having the foresight to say what next, because we can train them on the one phase of savings group formations, which I must admit has had a very positive impact of collaboration. But then we have to now start thinking of what is next. So the lessons learned for me, the key lesson learned was that we need to remain one step ahead. So we've taught them financial education. We've taught them how to do their sales and marketing. But I think we may have been lacking a bit in terms of what are the corporate governance issues, because this is what makes or breaks cooperatives. And at their annual general meetings, most of them just think that it's a time when you go and vote in the new executive and that's it. So they don't know what the right questions are. And this also not only applies to cooperatives, but it also applies to limited companies as well. Because when you look at the articles of association, which is a requirement for them to register their organization, most of them just print it off the internet and just change the details of the number of shares and so on without actually reading it. So these are some of the critical gaps that are out there and I think need to be addressed for most especially the growth-oriented SMEs.
Super, thank you for that, Jessie, much appreciated. And now moving on to the topic of finance for women-led businesses, particularly with regards to digital financial services. Betty has already made reference to that. I'm now going to ask Yolanda Gibb, who's co-lead for the trade team at WEI, to give us some thoughts and views and perspectives with regards to digital financial services to help support the growth of small micro enterprises in order to help them access different markets, but also to access different types of financial services. There's a lot of talk about financial inclusion and the role of technology to ensure that entrepreneurs can get access to financial support. Fintechs, as we know, have been innovating in this space and to some extent even beating the traditional conventional banking sector to really respond to the needs of small businesses. So Yolanda, based on your experience, how do you think innovation in the digital financial services sector can lead to greater financial inclusion for women and women entrepreneurs?
Okay, thanks, Keith. I'll start with a couple of things that I've been seeing over the last few years as I've been working in this space. And I guess, one of the early things is access to market opportunities on platforms. So we're going out on the basis that, women have access to these platforms because they have access to phones and they have access to a network. And I'll come back to that maybe later on. But there are like market opportunities, which connects buyers and sellers and those types of things, which can be useful. There's also the kind of market information, so particularly in agriculture sector, where there's been publishing of prices for different crops, and it allows women to make better decisions and think about how they want to sell and where and so on. What's interesting is also a study in Uganda of about 3,000 women noticed that when their money, their loans was provided to them and put directly into an e-wallet, so they received the money digitally, they were less likely to share it with family. So when it was received in cash, they were more likely to share it. This way it would go to its intended use, so those kind of benefits. And also, for example, one of the surveys that we did, we also saw that people would be more likely to save. So women would keep these micro amounts that were left in their wallets, and they would gradually build them up and they would save them and they'd be able to use them for something. So we can see some interesting positive effects going on there. And I was working on a project in Jordan last year around the whole COVID period. And what was really interesting is that the government started instituting a lot of changes to the Know Your Customer system. And so particularly people who were opening e-wallets, the system was easier. They could do it remotely because they couldn't move around because of the constraints, after COVID. And so that kind of more fluid approach to having people sign up for their accounts was interesting. Another thing that I've read in some places that up to 1 in 5 women around the world globally don't have the ID that they need to sign up for a bank account. And so that number varies, but sometimes it's 1 in 5 globally. And one of the things that I've been seeing that is being played around with is digital ID. So you have your digital ID in your phone. You can carry that around with you. Then, because we know that women are often likely not to have a credit history, what you can store is a transaction history that you can build up and that can gradually show that you're more and more credit worthy. So there are some of those kind of innovations that are perhaps directly tackling some of the problems that women are facing. There's also embedded finance, for example, in e-commerce platforms that's appearing, at the point of purchase. So, for example, when women might need loans or saving or insurance to buy, whatever their inputs might be, where that is embedded, that's also revolutionizing. I think the more it comes on board, it will revolutionize. There's other things, innovative approaches, pay as you go, but then being able to remotely lock the assets that you're paying for. And I mean, a whole host of things, that are under development or already in the marketplace. So I think in short, there are potential solutions, and there are solutions that are addressing some of the problems we see that women have. However, there are risks and barriers too.
And on that very point, I mean, you've spoken there, Yolanda, about how digital financial services can be part of the solution for greater financial inclusion for women-led businesses. Can we then pick up on the issue of what do you think are the potential risks or barriers that could constrain the adoption of digital financial services by women-led businesses?
Yeah, okay, yeah. At the kind of more global level, you've got things like the whole algorithms and that are driving these things are often based on a lot of male dominating data. So they may not get the woman entrepreneur's use case. And so something has to be done over time to address that issue. Obviously, there's a lot more males working in fintech that are developing solutions. So, I mean, it's the same kind of potential bias, although it may be unintended. You've also still got some of the regulatory constraints in that in some countries, women still have problems legally owning property and or opening bank accounts. So if those issues are not addressed, then, they're not directly related to the tech, but they are going to be an impediment. Then, as I kind of maybe hinted at the beginning, if women don't have access to phones, there is a lower accessibility to phones, feature phones, but then especially smartphones. And now some of these solutions, you can use a feature phone and you can still have access to them, but there's a lot more where the smartphone becomes necessary. And where that's not available, you obviously are prejudicing women entrepreneurs. Other things to maybe take into consideration is potential digital and financial literacy and the extent to which that may be lower in some populations. It combines then within something that is digitally accessing finance. And in fact, in some of the research that I've been involved in over the last 2 or 3 years, what often came up was just that the women basically preferred cash. perhaps not only the women, but it was just that cash is what we're used to. Cash is easy. In a particular project we did that was not for women entrepreneurs, but it was for women receiving their salaries via e-wallets. So the kind of things that they worried about was that actually the market wasn't that well developed. I know in some countries, especially in some African countries, this is much easier, but they couldn't use their e-wallets in as many places as they wanted to. So, there wasn't the network of merchants that they needed. There wasn't really a very dense network of agents for them to cash out if they wanted to. And also the interoperability between some of the digital financial service providers in the country wasn't really seamless and working yet. And so the kind of lack of maturity in that market, so again, this is very country dependent, but may find that as a result of that, what people are basically doing is just taking maybe the transactions through the digital means, but then cashing out and carrying on in cash. So it's a kind of two-tier, it's partly there, but it's not all of the way. So there are different barriers, some that are more policy, some that are more regulatory, some that are more ecosystem, and some that are inherently at the point of the woman, where if they got some more awareness raising, if they had some people that were using it, they often said, well, if I saw people in my circle making use of this and finding it helpful, I'd give it a go. So once you can find the kind of early adopters and use them to kind of cascade it out, perhaps.
Thanks, Yolanda. Now, to close out with one of the topics that we've been discussing here today have been focused around how do we go about accelerating the post-COVID recovery and support women-led micro and small enterprises. And we also have been considering and discussing how we can go about tearing up the rule book on finance for women-owned micro and small enterprises. So I want to close out by asking my panel just to reflect on what they think we should do, particularly around tearing up the rule book. What you think is perhaps the one key action that we can take going forward, particularly for the banking sector and for government policymakers and practitioners, perhaps, to even give consideration to ensure that we can accelerate the post-COVID recovery and best support women-led entrepreneurs. I'll start with Dinah.
Well, I think we need to rewrite the rule book. And within those rules, we have a huge call for sex disaggregated data, which many organizations, many banks, many policymakers don't use. And as my other colleagues have mentioned, there is so much unconscious bias, and we're really saying, think women first, whenever you're developing a product, a service. So sex disaggregated data and think women first. It's not 1, 2, sorry.
That's super, Dinah. Thank you for that. Betty, could I come to you? And I know if I can just ahead of that, perhaps frame my request for you to respond by, I know you speak a lot about the banking sector needing to adopt client-centric approaches to developing financial services. But besides that, perhaps there are 1 or 2 other actions, but if you wish to comment on that, that would be great as well, because I know that's such a fundamental need in the banking sector to be far more client-centric in how they go about offering financial services to women-led entrepreneurs.
Thanks for your question. My first observation about banks is that the smartest banks are already starting to work with those who provide services to women now in the informal sector. And they're saying, how do you do it? What can we do to link up? Because in some cases, the women are growing big enough that they need more money than you actually have. So how can we partner with you? So we actually have some work in this area, and it's exciting because the banks are having a huge number of aha moments. The savings groups are largely female, running between 75 and 90% women, and they're reliable, and they're demonstrating this reliability by their partnerships and their information flows back and forth between the two. So this is helping because this is client centricity right at the ground with what's working. With regard to the question of what the government should be doing, I think that the government has 3 steps. The first is make know your customers easier. I think that's going to be really important, particularly for women, and helping them. If you're going to set up a biometric identity system, start with the women, do them first. The second thing I think governments can do is they can tell the banks, we're going to start watching your data and seeing how you're doing on women. Because I will tell you that in 2018, the Bank of Zambia did the first survey on this question, and the information they found was horrifying. And they just turned right around and said, okay, we're going to expect you to report. We're going to expect you to tell us what you're doing, get beyond the pink products to real products. So that was very exciting. And now the insurance regulator is doing it at the same time. So that's very exciting. The third thing I think that the government can do is say, we recognize that there is a fundamental difference post-COVID in the issue of digital finance and digital arrangements. And so women, there's a gender gap in women having cell phones. And the government's here in Zambia has done quite a bit setting up the signal. But in terms of getting women cell phones, that's a real challenge. And, traditionally women have said, oh, cell phones like a crocodile, just sits there and eats. But when they discover they can actually get information that'll make their businesses better, they'll use them. The question is getting them there, getting people to understand and use them, getting fintechs to understand, let's develop products that can actually even be used by feature phones. So I think these kinds of things are pretty crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Jessie, over to you.
Currently in Zambia, we have just had a new ministry established with a cabinet minister, and this is focusing on small and medium enterprises. So for us, this is an exciting moment. I think we need to move fast and help them to integrate the various SMEs that we have on our database. I would like to believe that they are not starting from scratch. They're not starting from zero. We already have a pipeline of enterprises that have been trained. And this for us is a great opportunity where we can now align, most especially the women-owned enterprises, with the various interventions that the government has. For example, there's a new export market opening with a country with the biggest border in Zambia, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we now have these women and they don't know how to tap into that market. So therein lies our opportunity to work directly with the ministry and fuse in a pipeline of enterprises that may feed into these opportunities that are there. So it's exciting times. It's exciting times for us.
Jessie, thank you so much for that. Yolanda, what are your thoughts?
I mean, obviously, what my colleagues have said all is excellent points, and I don't think there's anything I would disagree with there. Maybe I'd just like to add, I think what's really important now is agility, that, partnership and agility, because this is a very quick, very rapidly evolving and moving sector. There's a lot going on. And I think the only way to counter that is to be rapid and to have partnerships and to move. And I think maybe the second thing that I'd say is involve women in the design of these solutions, because if they're not at the table, we all know how that ends up looking. So involve the women, the different client groups, the different user groups in the design, and make sure that they're part of the testing and the shaping of the products and services that are going out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda, much appreciated for that. And thank you to our panel of experts that we've had with us today. I'm going to close out just by quoting from the policy brief that we co-authored with colleagues from the UK, from the Lebanon, from the United States, from Argentina and Zambia, on the topic of the economic empowerment of women entrepreneurs in a post-COVID world. And in the concluding section, it says here, we recommend it is for the G20 government to drive a culture change in how banks provide services. And then there are two key recommendations here. Banks need to engage more actively with SME clients and design flexible compliance and credit scoring systems. That's the first one. The second one is banks need to consider the tie-ups that they need to have with microfinance institutions and self-help groups, as they often have better insights into clients' cash flow cycles and repayment capacities. And so by better understanding the life world of women-led businesses, the banking industry can better respond to their needs and design and develop services that are indeed customer-centric. So thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed this panel discussion. Thank you. Bye-bye.